Okay, well, I got your email that said you want to begin with an interview or with a most memorable student. Is
Yes.
that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I was thinking about actually when Dr. Kaft and no, I think it was just Dr. Kaft, did an interview with me regarding the Janus Project. You probably heard of that?
A little bit.
Her Janus Project. Okay, well, she's done interviews. They've done interviews with a lot of people too, and I remember that was one of the interesting questions. I thought at the time, I hadn't thought about it a lot, but my most student was one of my first students I ever had because I taught 16 years in public schools prior to getting a PhD and going to the University of South Carolina. And the second, might even been the first or second year I taught, I had a little boy named Robbie, who was just a peanut of a kid, tiny little kid with a crew cut, very skinny little guy, seemingly a pretty delightful little kid, but he could go from being a delight to being an absolute horror so quickly it would take your breath away. I mean, he was in fourth grade and he would swear at his teachers and fling his books across the room, and you'd hear things coming out of his mouth I never heard out of a fourth grader. And he would tip over his desk and attack other kids. I mean, he would get wild. And one of the things we had to do, I was in Minnesota at the time teaching. Like I said, it was my second year, and I learned real quickly of what EBD was from him, primarily because one of the things we had to do is in Minnesota we had to observe kids in their classroom, and when I went to observe them, the teachers all said, "You never know when Robbie's going to just flip out in the chairs. His desk is going to go flying, and he's going to be swearing, and it just happens for random reasons. You just don't know when it's going to happen." And I went in to do my observations. So we had to do, I think, 2 observations in 2 separate settings. And I was there when he did have these outbursts. But what I learned is they weren't just random. They didn't happen for no reason. The more I watched him, the more I realized there was a purpose in what he did. And that was whenever he was presented with a difficult academic subject, usually math, he would just flip out. And so what I learned from him is that there really is a function to student behavior. I mean, I didn't use those terms at that time, but I realized that it wasn't just out of the blue, that this was his deliberate way to get out of doing academics. It wasn't a very appropriate way to get out of doing academics, but it sure as heck worked for him. And so from that point on, I really kind of looked at kids with learning disabilities or with emotional disabilities in a different way, because when I had gotten my education, it was more psychoeducational, and you have to understand, what the motivation is. But I saw the motivation was he wanted to escape. He wanted to get away from that difficult math, and he just really chose an inappropriate way to do it. But because it worked, that's what he learned to do. And so I became more attuned with, I guess you'd say, the behavioral model. That what we need to do as teachers is really look at the behavior and decide what it is the kids get out of the way of doing things that they do. What is the payoff for them? If you can find that out, you can go a long way to working with a student. So that was my most memorable student, Robbie.
Okay. You covered everything on that too.
Oh boy.
So how did you get into the field of special education?
Well, actually, the way I got into the field of special education is I, like many other teachers, was prepared in history, in a different subject, to teach history at a middle school or high school level. And at the time I got my undergraduate degree, there were really no teaching jobs. It was extremely difficult to find a teaching job. And at the time, I had a good friend who I had campaigned for. He was the mayor of Brooklyn Park, where I lived, and actually Brooklyn Center. And he said, well, you might want to look into special education. That seems to be a real coming area. Now, this was mid to mid 70s, and special ed was just kind of getting started. So I kind of investigated it because public law 9, or the idea had not been passed yet, but Minnesota had a very similar law for probably 10 years prior to that. So I looked at the law and I examined special education. I thought, well, that's an interesting area. And so I took some courses and found out I really enjoyed it, and went to get decided to get a master's degree at St. Cloud University. And that's how I got into special education.
Okay. What was your original classroom like?
My first classroom was in what we then called junior high school, and now call middle school. And it was a ticket office where students would go to buy lunch tickets during the day. It was just, but the size of probably, well, you know what a ticket office looks like. I mean, they're not very big. And so I had 5 students in there. We had no desks, had to put them wherever we could. No budget to buy any books or anything like that. So I think my original caseload was it was self-contained, and Minnesota has laws and rules about how many can be in a self-contained classroom. I think it was either 10 or 12 at the time. And so I had 12 students or 10 students, but because, it wasn't a self-contained, it was a resource room, kids would come and go. So I probably had no more than 5 or 6 at a time, but they'd come and go all day long, like they do in a resource room. So then that was the service delivery model that I started teaching on. Later in my 16 years of teaching, I spent most of my time in self-contained classrooms for youngsters with emotional behavioral disorders.
What were your major roles and responsibilities?
Primarily as a teacher of, at the time in Minnesota where I was, there was no learning disability category and there was no emotional behavioral disorder category. They were lumped together in a category called Special Learning and Behavior Problems, or SLBP. And so I did essentially both, kind of teaching kids with emotional disabilities and learning disabilities. So primarily in terms of, at the time, most children with real serious emotional problems were educated either in special schools or self-contained classrooms. But because I was hired to teach in a resource room, most of the kids I originally worked with had more learning problems than they did emotional problems. And so my major role was as a learning disabilities teacher, primarily to teach reading and math.
Okay.
And it was in middle school, so I also did a lot of supportive work because at the time, Minnesota, you could be a resource room teacher, or they had different categories or what they call levels of service. And if they were not in resource room, they could be in a level of service called consulting, and where I would work with teachers to help them work with the students. So that was that were my original major roles and responsibilities. I did that for 4 years and then moved on to EBD programs, because after 4 years after the idea had passed, they did divide the categories up. So instead of SLBP, we did have LD and ED. And because I always kind of had an affinity for kids with emotional problems, that I went to an elementary school in a self-contained class for another 4 years.
Okay. What policies, people, and ideas have had the biggest influence on your career?
I would say, without a doubt, the biggest influence in my career was a fellow named Stan Dino. from the University of Minnesota. He invented curriculum-based measurement. I remember when I was a teacher, SLBB teacher, and working with kids with learning disabilities, we had a pretty strong local chapter of the Council for Exceptional Children, or a state chapter of CEC, and every year they put on a really nice conference. And so in my second year, I went to this conference. One of the sessions was put on by Stan Dino, who was at the time a new assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, and his doctoral student named Phyllis Merkin. And they talked about what they call database program modification, which has now become curriculum-based measurement. And I was quite impressed by what he was talking about, because what database program modification and curriculum-based measurement does is allows teachers to collect data through reading samples, like 1-minute reading samples, and then you graph it, and essentially allows the teacher to see if kids are progressing toward their goals. And you set the goals with CBM. And at the time, that was one of the biggest things I worried about, is I had no way to tell if what I was doing really made a difference or not. Because in Minnesota, we would test them at the beginning of the year, test them at the end of the year, and if they didn't do well, it was kind of like, oh, well, there goes another year in the kid's life. And so when Stan presented on his program, and I realized I could do assessments like every week and collect data, and I could tell if the student was progressing using my teaching. And if it wasn't, I could change my teaching. That was a huge impact on my career, totally changed my career, actually totally changed much of special education. So I would say clearly Stan Dino and the development of curriculum-based measurement was the biggest influence on my life, and that also, I think, is the biggest impact on special education.
So you let us know what you think is the biggest positive impact on special education, but what do you think is the biggest negative impact?
Well, I think misinterpretation of the least restrictive environment mandate of the law that essentially said students with special education should be educated in the least restrictive environment to the maximum extent appropriate. Well, that's good. We want all kids to be educated in the general ed classroom, but there is a way in special ed. The law allows us to move kids to more restrictive settings if necessary to provide an appropriate education. And misunderstanding that LRE requirement has led many school districts to say, we don't do special ed, we do inclusion. And so what you see is often, and I've seen this in many schools, kids being put in general ed classrooms inappropriate for them, where they're not learning, but because so-called meets it's an inclusive setting, people think it's all right. Well, actually, that's as illegal as saying all kids with disabilities have to be educated in segregated settings, because kids have to be educated in a placement that is most appropriate for their needs. So I think the misinterpretation of what least restrictive environment means has had a negative impact on the field.
What advice do you have for practitioners entering the field?
I would say my number one piece of advice would be know the evidence. Know what works, because there's a ton of research out there that really tells us how we can best teach kids with disabilities. For instance, curriculum-based measurement developed by Stan Dino. If we use that, we literally become scientists, because we can take the pulse of the child, take a measure of the child's educational health literally on a weekly basis. And if what we're doing isn't working, we can make changes. And so I'd say my advice would be know the evidence, and of which CBM is a very important evidence-based practice, and make certain that you use those. Another one of the problems we have in special ed is we know a lot more about what works than is actually makes its way into the classroom, because there's a gap between what we know and what we do. And the way to overcome that gap is through good preparation programs, in-school professional development activities on evidence-based practices.
Well, we just have one final question for you, and that is if you have any names of other people that could be interviewed for this project next semester.
Well, I would say if you really want to interview one of the persons who I think has made the biggest impact on special ed, that would be Stan Dino. He lives in Minnesota. He's a professor emeritus, so he's retired now. But he would be a great person to interview.
All right.
Probably the best.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for taking the time out for us.
You're quite welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.